Good afternoon or early evening, everybody, depending on where you are. My name is Wilhelm from ADHD in Iceland. I'm going to be the broadcast admin today. I will now play a short intro from Chantel.
A warm welcome to our viewers. My name is Chantel and I'm the lead of the ADHD Women Project under ADHD. I volunteer for our Belgium organization, which is a national organization with ADHD, ASC and LD Belgium. And I also volunteer for ADHD Europe, which is an umbrella organization with members across Europe, 32 national organizations to be exact. The webinar, Relationships, Workplace and Empowerment, is sure to be sharing experiences by two of our many professionals who contribute and support to the ADHD Women Project. They'll be speaking to us today and will be joining us in less than 2 minutes live. Our first speaker, Dr. Dora Winchank, will be speaking about the impact of ADHD at work, in families, relationships, and sexuality, and followed by Dr. Carr Fanning, Positive Disruptors and ADHD Women and their wins. So in the webinar, I will be speaking about how I am empowered and gender equality. Do tell us in the comments which country you are from. Please write it in the comments, but also note that your comments or any questions will be made public and might also be brought on screen by our technical team during the presentations of the speakers. First of all, I would also like to let the audience know that the ADHD Women Project was actually founded by two national organizations in Belgium and Germany. The project has now rolled out since 2021 on European level and beyond. The project started with a website giving information on social media and campaigning for women to share their personal stories. All of this information can be found on our website. For more information, you can visit the link tree, which is shown at the bottom of the screen, to access the social media, our website, and all our activities. And finally, it's ADHD Awareness Month. Across the globe, many people and organizations are celebrating ADHD Awareness Month to raise awareness of ADHD, sharing their personal experiences. The slogan, Understanding a Shared Experience, was created in partnership with the American Coalition and ADHD Europe. My personal interest is creating global awareness with the support of ADHD Europe's network. I would like to hand over the virtual microphone to our first speaker, Dr. Carr Fanning.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here with you this evening. As Chantal said, my name is Kate. I'm a lecturer in the area of psychology in the University of Bristol in the UK, but I am from Ireland originally. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a study that we're kind of in the middle of. We've just kind of finished kind of the main part of our data collection. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the experiences of girls with undiagnosed ADHD in education, the legacy of that experience, and empowerment opportunities in both education and employment. So I think it's really important to kind of talk about the start of this journey, the start of this study and where it came from. So I've worked with ADHD Europe for a long time, longer than I'm going to say, because I don't want to make myself feel any older than I already am. But Chantal, when they set up the women's group, you know, we'd been talking and she came and said, you know, one thing that they wanted to do, one thing they wanted to further was this idea of the empowerment of women. And so I reached out to some of my colleagues in Trinity College in Dublin and started thinking about how we can put together a study based on what the priorities of the Women's Project in ADHD Europe is wanted. So for us, I'm a big advocate for insider voice, that people who are directly affected by conditions should be reading the kind of setting the research agenda. So I'm really excited that I was able to support with this. So as I said, we're kind of in the middle of this project. So we literally finished collecting data a little less than 2 weeks ago. So what we did was we got women with ADHD from across Europe. So kind of the range was kind of from mid 20s up to early 40s, but the vast majority of the women involved were in their 30s, kind of in their mid 30s. We have a lot of different countries that were represented, which we're really excited about. All of the women who were involved in the study were diagnosed in adulthood. So I think when we're talking particularly about education, we need to think about that, you know, in terms of these women will have left education 10, 15 years beforehand. Co-occurrences were very common. The two most common co-occurrences in the women were anxiety and depression. So 84% had either one or both. And a lot of them actually were being treated for either anxiety or depression. And then actually through that process found out that they had ADHD. So we did individual interviews with 13 women, and then we did a focus group at the end of the week with 11 women. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is predominantly the findings, the preliminary findings that we found from the focus group. And I think it's really worth saying that we're looking at this as the first stage of a study. So we want to go on and do something much kind of bigger and go much more in depth. We boiled it down to kind of two areas where we thought empowerment might be important, which is in education and then also in employment. The women that we talked to were very adamant, the vast majority, all except one, that we needed to focus on education because that was where kind of empowerment began. And if anyone wants to add to the chat box and say, you know, I agree with this or I disagree with this, I would be really, me and the research team would be really interested to know. Because as I said, we really want this to be driven by people who have direct experience. So first of all, I'm going to move on now to talk about ADHD in girls and particularly talk about that in terms of kind of educational experiences and moving on to the workplace. So it's not to say that women, the women didn't struggle in primary school, but it seems that the struggles really began as they moved on into second level. Where there was increased demands for kind of managing different relationships with teachers, multiple assignments, trying to organize themselves, move around kind of much bigger schools, and that this is where they really started to struggle. And a couple of years ago, there was a study that came out called the Zurich cohort study, and they were suggesting that maybe ADHD symptoms didn't present in girls until they were kind of 12, 13, 14. And after listening to the women's stories, I'm starting to wonder, is it something environmental, like that they're really starting to struggle with the demands of the environment as they move up and get older and move on to second level and then on to third level or out into the workplace? I think what was really evident from the women's stories is that they felt that starting in education, that they were placed in boxes and they were essentially, they weren't the right boxes. So for example, a lot of them were frustrated that some of the difficulties that they were struggling with weren't recognized as ADHD, that they were labeled, as you can see here, Savannah from Scotland is talking about as like an unwilling participant or, you know, feeling quite like labeled the anxious worrier in school. Something to do with maybe how ADHD presents differently in girls and how they go unrecognized because they don't fit that stereotype of the, you know, hyperactive boy. And I think something that was evident from a lot of their stories was this idea of feeling bullied, and a part of that was feeling, you know, like they struggled socially with their friends and with their peers, particularly as they moved into that second level and then kind of beyond. And like the experience of bullying has been talked about in terms of peers in ADHD for a long time. And it has to be said that not all of the women talked about this kind of experience. Some of them said that their friends helped them get through secondary school, that they helped keep them on track, remind them when assignments were due. And I think something that we don't really talk enough about is perhaps the bullying, the oppression, the marginalization that happens from the wider educational structures. Okay, so made to feel different in school because you don't fit the norm of the good female student, that kind of stereotype. And what the women really talked about is that they were put in boxes when they were in school and they stayed in those boxes then as they grew up. So, you know, it's kind of like we leave school, but we never leave our school bag behind. It stays with us. And they talked about that, you know, in terms of, you know, constantly waiting to mess up or, you know, feeling like they couldn't do the most basic stuff. and feeling like that bullying and that oppression and made to feel different continued into their adult life. And I think, you know, a lot of them were talking about the scars, the remnants of that educational experience as they went into the workplace, you know, and a lot of them that's part of what they were saying was, you know, you need to start out by empowering women. You need to start out with empowering girls in education, because those effects stay with us. And it's really interesting. They got into a discussion at one point about that idea of education, okay, about creating a school system and a society and workplaces that are characterized really by acceptance of neurodiversity. And one of the things the women were saying was like, you know, it's not just about teaching teachers, it's also about teaching other children, because they're the future bosses and mentors and colleagues of girls and women with ADHD. And they felt quite uncomfortable disclosing in work. And one of the reasons they felt uncomfortable is that when they told, the first thing the boss would go away is Google, and all this negativity and all these kind of stereotypes, which maybe don't fit the female presentation of ADHD, would be what they'd see. And so that fed into it, feeling like they were kind of stuck in these boxes. I want to move on now to talk about some of the ideas of someone's popping up there in terms of agree. It starts with education. I want to talk about some of those experiences of empowerment in education. And I'd like to first of all say, you know, I think it's really important to kind of start out and be clear about the approach that we took when we talked about empowerment. So I can't empower you. You can't empower me. I can disempower you, you know, but empowerment is something that the person has to do for themselves. It's about having the knowledge, the skills, being able to make choices and feel like you can make choices and then act on those choices. So what we were talking to them about was, you know, opportunities that they'd had in education and opportunities they'd had in the workplace to feel that sense of empowerment. Like, I can do this. I've got this. And one of the things that was really evident from their stories was the idea that positive relationships really mattered. And I'm sorry that my words on the slides are going a bit wonky for some reason, but they were talking really about relationships with teachers and how it didn't matter what the subject was. If they got on with the teacher, they were able to stay engaged, they were motivated. But importantly, that if they felt accepted, you know, the teachers accommodated who they were. And I love this story from Scotland, where, you know, Savannah's talking about her art teacher, you know, praising her for a strength that she had, providing her with a quiet place to work, a place to escape the bullying. And a lot of these women were talking about this feeling of being overwhelmed by all the multiple demands, the sensory experiences of being in school and in the workplace as well. The other thing the women were talking about in terms of what led to their empowerment was this idea of finding their strengths. And on one hand, these were unique just to them as individuals. Like Alba from Spain was talking about growing up in a multicultural family and languages being her thing, and her making her, you know, doing well in school about that and then making it her career. But Butterfly from Germany was talking about, you know, she's a very accomplished researcher, and she was talking about, you know, being able to see patterns, connecting the dots, being creative, and really flourishing in that sort of an environment. And I think what's really interesting from what a lot of the women were talking about is that they were saying, you know, if you put me in a complicated situation or a crisis, I am the best person to be there. Okay. But it's the mundane, the basic things like getting your assignments in on time, you know, remembering to submit your invoices. That's the stuff that I really, really struggle with. You know, and oftentimes you have to get quite high up in your career to get those challenges, and the frustrations about that kind of administrative side of work and of school overshadowing some of these strengths that we really need to focus on. I think one of the other things that really stood out to us in the stories of the women was a sense of meaning and purpose that they had found in their lives, in their careers. And you can see here kind of two different women talking about, you know, one is becoming an advocate for neurodiversity, the other one has become a teacher. Both of them are using their experiences to help others. And a lot of the women who were involved had gone into very caring professions. And these are women who viewed themselves as perhaps struggling socially and as not picking up on social cues. And it takes massive social intelligence to be able to go into these roles. It takes huge empathy. And you know, in psychology, we talk about a psychology of meaning, you know, that people get lots of psychological well-being, happiness, you know, from you know, contributing to something bigger than yourself, for working and caring for others. But we did come away from this and wonder, you know, is that social intelligence? Is that empathy? Is that a strength that's associated with ADHD? Or is that perhaps what we call adversity quotient, or it's a type of intelligence that is developed through experiences of adversity, that because they struggled, they developed these skills and wanted to give back to others. I think that, you know, a lot of them were talking about masking and how exhausting and anxiety provoking that could be. You know, one of the questions we asked them was, you know, how have you managed to do so well? And all of these women, you know, objectively are very successful. And I know success is subjective. So somebody can be a stay-at-home mom and be successful, or somebody can be a CEO and be viewed as successful. But objectively speaking, all of these women were very successful. And we asked them the question, how have you managed to do so well? And what they said was masking, you know, but they didn't necessarily feel that sense of success. They just felt worn out by trying to keep the mask up, trying to pretend to be normal. And that's, you know, that's a real challenge that girls in school and women in the workplace with ADHD are perhaps struggling with. But we also have to recognize the massive social intelligence that takes, you know, that real sense of awareness of others and awareness of self. And again, these are women who don't think that they are picking up on social cues well. They're feeling bad about this, but it does show that there is a lot of social intelligence there. When we're talking about it from an educational perspective, kind of back when these women were younger, when they started thinking about what was it that got them into their current careers, that made them feel empowered, they talked about this sense of kind of community, and in different ways. So on one hand, kind of giving to the community and building a kind of a strong sense of identity and getting confidence. So for example, you know, Rosaline in Ireland is talking about, like, I didn't do well in school, so I started working in my community. I started working with other young people, and, you know, this gave me a sense of feeling empowered because I was empowering others. And Savannah in Scotland is talking about getting involved in a theatre club, finding strength, finding passion, and then going on and working in that industry when she became older. So I think sometimes when we talk about empowerment in education, we think of school, but actually there are lots of opportunities out there beyond the kind of school walls. Sorry, just my slides have messed up. But in terms of when it does work in school, what the women were talking about was, you know, and this is some examples, like from Sonia from Romania, was saying what helps her in work and what helped her in school was that people just accepted that she was, in her own words, a little bit clumsy, and they either helped her in a nice way or they just didn't say anything and let her get on with it until she got there. And Rosaline is talking about providing a lot of structure, breaking things down, you know, and providing reminders in a really nice, friendly way. And all of them were asking for flexibility. And that flexibility was really characterized kind of by acceptance. I want to move on now, because I'm conscious of time, to talk about employment. What I think is really interesting, though, and as I've said already, the women were quite focused on education. Even when we tried to move them on to talk about employment, they often talked about their experiences in employment, drawing back on their experiences in school. But there were lots of opportunities in terms of things that worked once they left school. So that in many ways, like Sonia in Romania is talking about this idea of work being more rewarding, because she was doing something she loved and she felt really passionately about, and that she kind of got she called it an arousal. So she kind of got a buzz out of her work. And while that could be tiresome, you know, because she was doing what she loved rather than a subject she was being forced to, that's really what kind of kept her engaged, made her successful. Another thing women were talking about in terms of workplaces is that workplaces actually can sometimes be more flexible. Okay. So, you know, and some of them were talking about, like, I've had wonderful jobs, and oftentimes when the jobs worked for them, it was in very dynamic, fast-paced environments where being maybe a little bit fast-paced actually was kind of valued, where everybody kind of worked in that way, or people were working in a very flexible way, like we're doing now post-COVID, right? That we're not necessarily having to be at our desks 9 to 5 in every job, or finding places like innovation or research where you have that flexibility that works. You know, you can kind of work in your own way and maybe on your own schedule, not having to be in at kind of like 9 o'clock in the morning. And one of the women, and her quote isn't up there, was saying that, you know, one of the things she asked for in her job was to start after 10 o'clock because she really struggled to sleep. And once they gave her that, she didn't mind working like later on in the evening because she was there. And when she was there, she was engaged. And oftentimes you can ask for stuff like that in the workplace, but it's more difficult maybe to ask for that or for schools to accommodate it. There's also perhaps a little bit more opportunities in workplaces. A lot of the women who had assistants found that like really, really supportive. And one of them actually gave up part of her salary to have an assistant. So to kind of manage that kind of executive function piece that she was really struggling with. But again, as we were talking about earlier, I can't, so Chantal's just said, can you see the questions under the comments? I actually can't see any questions. So I apologize if people are asking questions and I'm not. Let me see. Oh, I've just found a whole bunch. Let me go back to the beginning. So I can see that some of the feedback, I think. That's great. I'll come back to maybe some of those at the end. I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. So yeah, that there might be more opportunities to work in a flexible way and to create that kind of culture of acceptance. And really, when you listen to the stories, that's what the women were asking. You know, we talk about in education and we talk about employment, we talk about accommodations or differentiation, like making a little change, but really inclusion, okay, and empowerment is about changing the whole system to where we're one of, you know, acceptance and celebration of diversity, and neurodiversity, obviously, in particular. There were downsides to the workplace for what the women were saying. The admin, and they really, really talked about how difficult that was. And a lot of that was carried through from those educational experiences. And they're talking about being able to work at a really high level, very bright, very ambitious, very fast-paced women, but kind of feeling a lot of shame in workplaces where they couldn't do the kind of basic things, as I was saying, kind of paying your invoices or, you know, doing your paperwork. And really, again, asking for a little bit of time and a little bit of space or a little bit of support, like admin support, to do that. Some of the women were saying they wouldn't take a job if they didn't have that kind of administrative support. Another thing, and this goes back to what I was saying in terms of what they were asking for, was that a lack of understanding and acceptance and education in the workplace really, they felt, led to kind of bullying or feeling marginalized intentionally or otherwise. That's kind of me for the kind of main kind of part of the presentation. And what I really want you to take home is that it can work. All of these women's had stories from education and from experience, from education and from employment, where they had been empowered, where they had felt accepted, included, and valued for what they brought to the situation. But there are also lots of barriers out there that women with ADHD are experiencing. You know, and I was looking at Twitter yesterday, and they were talking about, you know, when we're talking about female empowerment, traditionally what we're talking about is white women and their empowerment. And I think we need to broaden the education beyond the discussion beyond that to other marginalized groups, and particularly obviously what we're talking about this evening is the marginalization, is the empowerment of neurodivergent women. And I think either way, whether you get it right or whether you get it wrong, particularly in education, it leaves a lasting legacy. You know, as I said earlier, you know, we carry those school bags with us kind of for the rest of our lives. And if it goes well, that's brilliant. But if you're put into that little box, maybe not as great. I'm going to come over to the chat now. And what I'm seeing, and Chantal, stop me if I'm wrong, broadcasting ADHD Europe and a couple of links. But I'm not actually seeing any questions. But I really welcome any questions or any contributions, or if you have any feedback for us in terms of the study and things that we're looking at or not looking at, I'd be really interested to hear.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but if Chantel or Nina can send them to me.
Okay. I mean, if there are no questions or no comments or no feedback, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll pass you over to Dora now.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much to ADHD Europe, sorry, for inviting me to speak to you tonight. I'm incredibly happy, and I'm just thrilled to know that it's October again. It's ADHD Awareness Month. I'm so conscious of the destigmatizing work that ADHD Europe and other organizations do. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Now I'm going to present my screen, my slides, but I think what I need to do is actually go onto full screen so that you don't see my slides on the side. So let me just try and sort this out quickly. I'm not sure why. Let me try. I would like to present my slides. No, I'd like to, let me just try this again. I'm going to stop the screen. I'm going to present. I'm going to do my slides, and I'm going to do it from my computer. No, I want to present my full screen, and I'm not sure why this isn't a share screen. Let's try that. Okay. Good. Okay, let's see.
I can actually share it for you.
Can you? I want to have it from the beginning, like that. Is that? Can you see my full slide? Not cut off.
No, you're not. You stopped sharing.
Not sharing. Okay, so let's just
share.
try.
Share again.
Share. Present. Choose window. Yes, but
something's coming up. Yeah.
Okay, so have you got my full slide and not just part of my slide?
There we go.
You've got my full slide.
Good to go.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I apologize about that little technical glitch. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you tonight about an intimate relationship with ADHD. I have got about 20 minutes to talk to you about sexuality in ADHD relationships and work. And I'm going to be presenting to you some of the research that's been done in this field. So just to tell you, I don't have any conflicts of interest. I'm a psychiatrist. I work in the Netherlands. I work with Sandra Coy in an ADHD clinic for adults, and I'm also involved as a researcher in the field of ADHD. So before we talk specifically about ADHD and sexuality, perhaps we need to take a step back and ask, what affects sexuality? Well, we know that both biological and environmental factors have an influence, and those developmental disorders that impact the way we socialize can also affect sexuality and may have an effect on the quality of romantic relationships. Now, to make this a bit more practical, if we think about the lifetime symptoms of untreated ADHD, so people who are inattentive or forgetful, who might have mood swings, anger outbursts, who's sensation-seeking, take risks, or are impulsive, you can imagine that in this case of untreated ADHD, you'll have difficulty in starting relationships or keeping them going, in maintaining relationships. And further, it might even have an impact on how easily you establish a secure sexual identity. And this is an enormously important developmental goal in the transition from childhood to adolescence and then beyond. establishing your sexual identity. So looking at gender variance, this is in fact a new field. What is gender variance in children with ADHD? Well, to summarize it quite quickly, it's simply the wish to be the other gender, not feeling comfortable in your birth assigned gender. So according to parents of children with ADHD, there appears to be more gender variance, 4.8%, compared to parents reporting about children who don't have ADHD, where it's less than 1%. If you look at other disorders like autism, then in fact it's much higher. There's a 7.6 times higher likelihood to express gender variance. With ADHD, it's 6.6 times. So in place number 1 is autism spectrum, and in place number 2 is ADHD. And this has been in research related to the elevated emotional symptoms in ADHD. And what's interesting is that it occurs equally in boys and girls, females and males. Now, these rates of gender variance do depend, according to another study from last year, on the underlying diagnosis. Again, we see in this particular study, autism spectrum taking place number 1 at about double the rate of ADHD, 2.5%. Now, moving from gender variance, let's talk about age of first sexual intercourse. We know that teenagers with ADHD are often quite impulsive. And when this was studied related to how old they were with first sexual intercourse in boys, in males, the studies have certainly showed that the mean age was younger compared to those without ADHD. This was also replicated in a long study which went on for 13 years, comparing children with ADHD to typically developing children, and again, a younger age at first sexual intercourse was found in these boys. What's interesting is where they conduct problems, so sometimes aggressive kind of behaviors, there was a moderate association with this and ADHD and age at first sexual intercourse. So boys who have ADHD and conduct problems of all of the groups have the youngest age of first sexual intercourse. Now let's look at what happens in girls. Okay, so studies in girls interestingly showed no difference between those girls who did and did not have ADHD. However, when it came to oral sex, girls with childhood ADHD would have oral sex at a significantly younger age, with nearly twice as many oral sex partners than their non-ADHD peers. In terms of sexual contact in ADHD, you can, as I've already mentioned, understand why untreated ADHD brings forward significant impairments in interpersonal relationships. Where there's untreated ADHD and it's severe, there can be maladaptive coping strategies which impact on romantic relationships. A higher number of sexual partners has in fact been studied and associated with ADHD in several different studies. But it's not just earlier sexual contact or more partners, it's also risk-taking behavior in the realm of sex. For example, unprotected sex or having sex while intoxicated, which is more likely to lead to situations of abuse. So unprotected sex itself can lead to infections, unwanted pregnancies. So these are potentially really problematic for people, young people who have undiagnosed and untreated ADHD. Now, going a step beyond sex and into the realm of violence, we know that people with ADHD have an increased risk of intimate partner violence, and particularly verbal violence. But don't forget that those with ADHD are more often the victims of sexual violence. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later about a big survey we're doing amongst women in the world and the experience of ADHD. And this is one of the areas that we are asking women about, asking them to share. So what about the relationship? When you get into a relationship and you have ADHD, how easy is it to stay together? Well, I'm going to talk to you now about a study that came from Turkey, and this study looked only at heterosexual relationships, but where one partner had ADHD, it asked the question, does it make a difference whether it's the male or the female partner? And of course, this is a limited study because it looked at the heteronormative approach, so it didn't look at same-sex relationships or polyamorous relationships. But just to talk to you briefly about ADHD in relationships, compared to control groups, people with ADHD tend to have more marriages and more divorces if one person has ADHD. And in addition, ADHD has been associated with less satisfaction, less stability, and less success in romantic relationships for the reasons I outlined in the beginning of my talk. So this Turkish study of 62 heterosexual couples used what's called the marital impact checklist and asked some questions that might seem a bit obvious. First of all, it examined gender roles. Now here you can see the typical male gender role in pink being responsible for domestic chores and cleaning and the children, whereas the woman's typical role being involved with DIY, no, but not. So one of the things this question, the study looked at was how traditional roles, like non-egalitarian roles in a relationship, were impacted when one person had ADHD as opposed to egalitarian roles, where there was more sharing among the responsibilities. We know what the traditional roles for women are. They're childbearing, childcare, meeting the needs of the rest of the family before your own, and only working if everyone else's needs have been met. Whereas traditional roles for men are providing income for the family and being the final say in big, important decisions. In an egalitarian setup, both partners have equal responsibility for family, work, and education. So that's just a little refresher. This marital impact checklist that looked at the 62 couples looked at things like how easy it was to complete tasks, how good one's working memory was, how well one could manage time, how effective one's communication was, and one's ability to emotionally regulate oneself. And the first question was the severity of ADHD and negative marital impact of ADHD are correlated. And the answer to that from this study is yes. The worse the ADHD, the more its negative impact on a relationship, on a marriage. And of course, these were untreated ADHD. And it made no difference in the study who evaluated the impact. It could have been the male or the female partner with ADHD. They would both judge their marriage the same way. The more severe the ADHD, the more its impact on the marriage. The second hypothesis was that the marital impact of ADHD in couples is greater where the partner with ADHD is a woman. And you probably are thinking, is this true? Isn't it true? Well, if you chose yes, you're correct. Why is that so? Well, where the ADHD partner is a woman, she would tend in the study to have more ADHD symptoms, more severe ADHD symptoms, and higher scores of inattention and hyperactivity. But further, she would describe more likely the feeling of being unloved, unimportant, feeling ignored, and all of this had a negative impact on the marriage, as you can imagine. Where the ADHD partner was a woman, she tended to have far less support. Men, on the other hand, with ADHD could count on their partner or other family members to support them, to help them, to compensate, whereas women tended to have to deal with everything on their own. The third hypothesis of the study is that the impact of ADHD is greater amongst relationships where the roles are more traditional as opposed to egalitarian. And thinking about this, if you think the answer is yes, well, you're right. Men with ADHD tended to be married and choose partners who were more egalitarian, whereas women with ADHD and their husbands were equally egalitarian. It seems that men with ADHD do better when they have an accepting egalitarian spouse, not expecting the traditional roles from that man, and an egalitarian relation can better tolerate a spouse, particularly a woman who has ADHD. So the more severe the ADHD, in fact, the more egalitarian and the more sharing the partners became. So they would tend to share their tasks. On the other hand, the more traditional the gender role in the ADHD spouse, the more the non-ADHD spouse felt unloved. So the take-home message here is marriages work better if one partner has ADHD, if they are egalitarian. Now keep your questions for the end. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about ADHD in the workplace, just to tell you quickly that there have been some negative occupational outcomes associated with ADHD. So people with ADHD have struggled with unemployment as a result of their ADHD. They may lose their jobs, have less or lower occupational rank, financial problems, and work incapacity to take off sick leave. People who have untreated ADHD will confront frustration with themselves. They will feel that, as you heard before from Kate, that their employers are disappointed. They're not rated highly and they change jobs frequently. So the workplace can be incredibly stressful for these people and for these women with a high risk of accidents and injuries at the workplace. So what predicts unemployment? Well, it's the combined presentation of ADHD, but also ADD and having high current ADHD symptoms. If you have comorbid alcohol or drug abuse and anxiety and depression, which Kate mentioned are so commonly comorbid in women with ADHD, you're going to have more chance of ending up unemployed. Poor sleep is also impacted in the work environment. We know from our studies in The Hague that a majority of people with ADHD have sleep problems, either sleep deprivation or delayed circadian rhythm. They can't regulate their emotions, and these impact their functioning at work too. So on top of the ADHD, women with sleep problems are going to have worse problems in the workplace. Now, how do they describe their workplace? Well, women said that their employment was important for their self-identity. So it helped them make sense of who they are beyond just simply earning money. But they also described the workplace as being confusing, overwhelming, and chaotic. And some of the issues that these women mentioned in the study was that women particularly often cannot take medication for ADHD when they're pregnant or choose not to, which leads to more problems at work, and they have to use non-pharmacological coping mechanisms at that time. I want to talk to you a little bit on a positive level about the advantages of ADHD. That was what one of the women in Kate's study mentioned. Why don't I ever hear about the positives? So in the workplace, there are some aspects of ADHD that are impairing in one environment, but are incredibly positive in another. So that would be having broad attention and distractibility, because studies have shown that these both enhance creative thinking. In fact, amongst highly creative children, 40% had ADHD symptomatology. The ability to be able to drift off is highly conducive to being creative. Moreover, many people and women with ADHD have got to where they are by being enormously resilient, and these skills are very helpful in the work environment. Other advantages of ADHD are being spontaneous, energetic, having the ability to hyper-focus, being efficient and productive when you hyper-focus, and being able to complete a task without being distracted. And of course, as I said, creativity is a very important positive factor. Because if you can be defocused and process all sorts of information that seems unrelated to your task, you're more likely to come up with an uncommon, out-of-the-box association and therefore be creative. You can combine information in original ways. You can have a lot of energy, be impulsive, and risk-taking all seem to help with creativity. People who are too bound by the rules and scared to be impulsive are less likely to be creative. Moreover, research has also shown that adults and women with ADHD are courageous, have good conversational skills, have good social intelligence, as you heard from Kate, can see the humorous side of things, and have enormous empathy for others and humanity. So the study participants from this particular study showed that they had a positive mental approach and as a result were more successful socially. Now, I want to talk to you in my last minute about the ADHD Women Survey, which we're doing with ADHD Europe. There was a lack of research focused on adult women with ADHD, and what we're particularly interested in is the view of the women themselves. So we hope to collect information from thousands of women living with ADHD. Of course, we'll keep the information confidential and it'll be integrated into a scientific study. We want to understand the experience of women living with ADHD. We want to explore the links between ADHD and other health conditions, some of which psychiatric, so depression, anxiety, other comorbidities, but also cardiac health, immunological health, general health, exposure to violence, trauma, substances. We want to learn more so we can understand why women are not being diagnosed, why they're being missed, why the majority of women are in fact diagnosed in adulthood, as Kate said. And we want to be able to choose future research goals based on what's told to us by the women. So we can research based on the need of women living with ADHD and of course build appropriate interventions. So if you're interested in participating in the study, then I would ask you to please contact Chantel. We are waiting for final medical ethical approval of our study, but I think it's going to shed enormous light on how women experience ADHD. I want to thank you very much for your attention now. It's been a pleasure participating this evening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions if there are questions for me. So, thank you.
Well, let's see. At least one, I think, here.
Do SSRI antidepressant drugs have a negative impact on ADHD? Is there any evidence for this? Well, no. As far as I know, they do not have a negative impact. What I would say has a far worse impact on ADHD is untreated depression and anxiety. So, as we know, these comorbidities are extremely common. A majority of women tend to internalize their symptoms. So instead of outwardly displaying their symptoms, they push them in. That leads to huge stress and with time a lower self-esteem and possibly developing depression as a result. Further, women often can see that they've got enormous demands being made on them. They have a lot of roles that they need to play. They have a lot of balls that they need to juggle. They often are not helped. And this can make them extremely anxious. So both anxiety and depression are high up there in the list of comorbidities. And at our clinic, and as far as I know in the published literature, the use of SSRIs is an extremely good way to help women deal with depression and anxiety symptoms and get those better, sometimes before even starting with ADHD medication and coaching and support and psychological treatment. So I would say that, in fact, SSRIs play a very important role in the treatment of comorbid ADHD, depression and anxiety. Right, do we have any other questions?
This is a follow-up from Dr. Emma King. Is there any antidepressants which are better to use?
Okay. I think, look, there's 6 antidepressants in the class of the SSRIs, and they all have slightly different profiles and side effect profiles. Some of them, for example, cause more sexual side effects than others. I would say that sertraline or escitalopram are 2 drugs that I would use as first choice, frankly, just in terms of their lower side effect profile. Yeah, so those are the ones, but I don't think that there's any research to show that one is better than the other. It depends how familiar a clinician is with the particular medication and the side effect profile that you're choosing. One can, of course, use non-SSRI antidepressants. As a third line, one could use bupropion, which is an antidepressant which has dopaminergic action too. So you could use that to treat ADHD, although does take third place because it is less effective than the stimulant medication. Yeah, any other questions or comments or people wanting to share their experience?
I'm not seeing much more questions unless Chantel and Nina can do something to me. Well, there's a lot of thank yous, like from Emma and from
Okay.
Ace. Yeah, anything here?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, I see some thank yous. Thank you, Emma. Great. Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, then I would just like to ask you again. Thank you, Joanne. I'd like to ask you again, if you are interested in spreading the word about our ADHD Women Survey, then please contact Chantel, and hopefully shortly we'll be able to start collecting the email addresses of women who want to participate. But I just think it's absolutely wonderful that we can have these kind of education sessions. I'm deeply grateful to ADHD Europe, ADHD Iceland for facilitating this. And yeah, I think that it's just wonderful that we can go ahead as women, gain more knowledge, and work together to destigmatize ADHD.
Thank you. Now, shall we hand over the virtual microphone to Chantel? Let's see.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, this is a pre-recording. However, I am following your comments and questions on our social media channels. I will also be sharing today how I've been empowering myself for the last 5 years and finding the confidence to speak on camera and advocate at European Parliament. I'll also be sharing about gender equality, what it means to me, the work I'm doing, and how I feel this can help combat stigma and discrimination for all men and women living with ADHD, their families, and their carers. To me, ADHD Day is every day. So how did it all begin? Well, I first met Joanne in 2017 when I was inquiring for more information and support for my son that was 16 years at the time. Then I started realizing that Joanne actually was sitting at a kitchen table with Donnelly Barber many, many years ago. And Joanne formalized our national organization. Joanne and Donnelly were following the ADHD Women Project. Joanne actually created all our resources on the website. So thank you so much, Joanne. And both these two lovely ladies have been facilitating our Knowing Me, Knowing You peer-to-peer support groups, which are held bi-weekly and attended by the global community. Many women from different countries are joining us, and women are sharing their experiences, supporting each other, talking about how to manage the ADHD and so forth. I personally attend for support myself, and I love listening to all the personal experiences that are shared and the advice that I am able to take with me for my daily life. So there's been such a lack of education, but things are changing. There's more literature becoming available, and professionals are speaking openly at events online. I'm sure you've watched so many YouTube videos and read so much good information online. You know, it really helps us better understand why we're so disorganized, that we're easily distracted, we're exhausted, our hormones, our puberty, and so forth, and being later diagnosed in life, which is becoming such a big problem at the moment, and all this overwhelmment. So how did it all begin? After I first met Joanne, I started volunteering and was my first conference event ever in Belgium. And I was so lucky to have met Dr. Ellen Littman, who helped me close so many doors. Obviously, I was never diagnosed, and therefore all the symptoms, the indicators, the red flags made sense to me. And I was able to close some chapters in my life and have a better understanding and know why I was being misunderstood and dealt with a lot of, issues women deal with, when they're not properly treated. Then, the year after, I met Professor Sandra Coy in Malta at our AGM of ADHD Europe. She is a long-standing professional advisory member of ADHD Europe and an expert in female ADHD. She has her own clinic, and she has done so many webinars for us, and she's absolutely amazing. I also recently met Dr. Dora Winchank, who's our speaker today, and she is South African like I am, and also speaks very good French, and she joined the ADHD Europe membership in 2020. From day one, she's been involved in the ADHD Women Project, and she is highly recognized globally for touching on interesting topics, research, and shares her valuable knowledge to reduce the lack of education that exists today. I also want to bring across that both Dora and Sandra have been involved in the DIVA 2. If you don't know what the DIVA 2 is, the DIVA 5, sorry, go look at the website www.divacenter.eu. There's diagnostic interviews for adults with ADHD, children aged 5 to 17, and for people with intellectual disability. This is called the Young Diva. It's in many languages, it's low cost, and it's online, and a very useful tool that you can print out and show your healthcare professional. Well, that's what I would do, seems there's a lack of education in healthcare. Another speaker, which was speaking just now, and I really got to know Dr. Kate Carr Fanning better, and she's actually served on the ADHD Europe board and now is part of our team with our professional advisors of ADHD Europe. I would like to thank both Dr. Winchank and Dr. Kate Carr Fanning for their enthusiasm and working alongside ADHD Europe and the ADHD Women Project. As explained in the results of the positive disruptors, we are so excited to share all this information as soon as it's available. With thanks to our Swedish, I've come to learn about Dr. Lotta Skoglund. I hope I said that correctly. She's been authoring so many educational books with different professional groups, teachers, psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, and lawyers. She's a frequent guest on national TV and radio shows and such an active advocate for the patient perspective. So I'm really looking forward to my future work with all four of these ladies that are in the European Union. I could talk for hours and hours about my experiences, but in summary, I can say that there were things that I didn't understand and people understood. I faced so many challenges and uncomfortable situations due to not being diagnosed, including anxiety and depression. I'm learning more each day about how women manage their lives. ADHD casts such a dark shadow over so many of our childhood and adolescence years. When we grow up, we become women, we encounter such interpersonal problems, academically, professional failure, and personal suffering. There's like a lack of respect for the basic differences in men's and women's bodies and our brains, how we work. Girls are missed. And when some healthcare professionals do not know the symptoms, this just creates non-effective treatment. And I was left undiagnosed and untreated. I entered adolescence and young adulthood. I encountered a lot of range of adjustments and problems that led me to eat irregularly, low self-esteem, underachievement, and early smoking habit during my teen years. So these are really personal things that I'm sharing with you, but I have the confidence now to be on camera and to share. So I'm not going to read everything that was on the screen. Do rewind and have a look. And do come join our support group meetings to talk about your experiences and so forth. I'm just trying to change the screen. It doesn't want to hop over. There we go. So now I'm going to hop on to gender equality. Why do you think men and women feel disempowered? Could you write that in the comments? And how would you describe your experiences about gender equality? I can share some while you're writing all this down in the comments. You know, there's this biological gender difference in female hormones affects the way ADHD expresses itself in different individuals. We have gender expectations. There's higher requirements on girls' social competence. And this also affects how society views us and interprets ADHD symptoms. You know, I've mentioned before, our brains organize differently. We don't have testosterone, compared to men who have different sensory responses than we do. Some of us, we find it difficult to handle complex situations and our behavior in social interactions. This might be difficult with the families, with friends, or having social situations. So this can also be traumatizing and very hurtful. When boys and men talk about the same things, ADHD is often the first thing that comes to mind. Thus, these deeply rooted structural gender role expectations have led to more than just overdiagnosing boys. You know, women are expected to look after their family and nurture everyone. Does the history of gender bias stem from people thinking that ADHD only affects me? You know, ADHD develops in childhood and disappears, that only those who misbehave have ADHD. Women are struggling with undiagnosed ADHD. Their sense of shame and not being able to do all the things like other women do is all consuming. Our comorbidities are so different and everything is exacerbated by the negative effects of hormones. In some women are late menopause. So since childhood, many women have heard criticisms and felt judged, unlike boys who are often socialized to deflect criticism onto other people. It was my friend's fault, we got in trouble, not mine. My teacher's just mean, that's why she failed me. You know, girls with ADHD tend to internalize all this criticism. We assume we're at fault for every bad thing that happens around us. Gender role expectations, whether we want it or not, there exists different expectation on girls and boys, women and men. On a structural level in society, the expectation for girls to behave well, not be different, and subcoordinate to adults and boys can be a wrench in the gears, both for ourselves and for girls. So gender roles and shame. Women are ridiculed for their ADHD traits as girls and are not supposed to exhibit all of this in society. And society thinks that they mean. You know, you don't care about what other people have to say when you blurt out words. This is how society perceives things, but it just happens. Our contributions and is more important than other people's when we interrupt each other. And this is not the case. You know, some people think that we disrespect the people around you, or we inconvenience them, or we forget important things that we should have done. You don't, you know, sometimes we're late and it's not on purpose. And for example, I get in a lot of trouble because I get told to clean my room all the time because I just can't be bothered half the time to pick up some clothes that I threw on the floor. So this is the way we is. So I've written on the screen, even though I said some negatives of how society affects us, but we can have our voices heard. We are all a support network. You know, by sharing experiences is just great advocacy work. All the literature, all the good information out there, and we can change the lives so we can all have a better quality of life. We need to stand together for girls and women who come after us, including the husbands and the boyfriends. For those, we need to keep from being called a space cadet. First we talk, then we catch ourselves doing ADHD things, interrupting, daydreaming, blurting out. That men get away with, we can say, too bad I'm not a guy. They're allowed to interrupt. We have to be brave and we have to speak up. Until we do, we'll remain space cadets. If we struggle, we need to struggle together. Only then can we beat the stigma of all our brain differences. So I'd like to say thank you very much for tuning into this webinar. We've had some great speakers this evening, and I am definitely planning to ask them to come and talk again with some new topics for next year. On the screen, I have 3 links. Please do take a camera shot or replay it. Go look, have a look at our ADHD Women link tree with all the activities, social media, and so forth, and ADHD Europe's link tree, which will take you to a living library, which actually got launched at our Leiden event on Saturday the 15th. And it shows a whole lot of books for children, for parents, for teenagers, adults, and women. At the moment, it's only in Dutch and English, but it will be rolled out, hopefully, in some more languages. And definitely come catch up or watch some of our other videos from experts, professionals, and researchers. So once again, thank you for tuning in and have a lovely day or evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chantel. Thank you, Dora. Thank you, Kate, for wonderful presentations. Let's see if there are any comments. There are a lot of comments here, but most of them are just saying hi or saying thank you, but I'll put some of them up. There is one that was in the banner earlier. Many of those comments you can see if you go to YouTube broadcasting ADHD Europe, or to their pages, or their Facebook pages of ADHD Europe and ADHD Women. I'll just throw some of them up here. I don't think I can bring anybody in to comment on them. See, I think there's a listed telepathy on how we are supposed to think and feel. Okay. Good point. Yep. Definitely that. And there's a lot of interesting things. So a lot of this is coming from the YouTube channel. Yep, this is actually Facebook. And I recommend you guys to log in there, watch this game, and check out the comments. So, all right. Let's take this one out. So, to all of you, thank you for watching Broadcasting ADHD Europe. Have a good night.